You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Baby Dragons Cried, Please Don't Hurt Us, Mommy is Dying. What the human did next shook the galaxy. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The sky bled and would not stop. It bled through cracked clouds, through torn contrails, through the spear wounds of falling ships. It bled over a plain of broken glass, where a city had once sung with copper bells and river light. Evening came like a bruise across Threxus Roman 4, and the last human on the surface limped out of the smoke with a rifle dragging, a visor spiderwebbed, and ash embedded in every seam of his battle suit. Corporal Mason Reel had been raised under the white ceilings of Titan Station, where storms were measured in equations, and childhood was a row of neat bunks. He'd been taught to fear vacuum, fire, and the dark between ships, but not the quiet that followed a battle. That quiet found his bones and started to hollow them. He walked with the slow, automatic care of a man counting the cost of every step. Burned polymer squeaked at his joints. The air tasted of metal and rain that could not fall. Somewhere, a pressure vessel was venting. It called across the rubble like an animal trying to breathe. He should have turned back. There would be no evac now, no unit to rejoin. Echo Team had burned in the final push to secure the primary Threxian spire, and the fleet had pulled out as if ashamed. The quiet broke on a single sound, thin as a wire, fragile as a hairline crack. Crying, Mason halted. The wind dropped like the planet holding its breath to listen. He turned his head, heard it again. The sound carried innocence into a place that had none, and suddenly his training felt like a lie told by a room full of lights and metals. He moved toward the sound, weaving through rebar ribs and slabs of melted stone, down a heat-curled corridor that led to a chamber almost intact. The floor was dusted with silvery ash. The air trembled with the last warmth of a firestorm. In the center lay a bowl of fused steel and stone, and inside it were two small creatures, reptilian, winged, eyes huge in narrow faces, huddled together and keening. Baby dragons, Threxian hatchlings. Behind them sprawled a larger form, scales blackened to a dull, cracked mirror. In life she would have filled the chamber. Even in death, the mother's presence pressed against the room like a cathedral fallen on its knees. Her golden eye was half open, watching nothing. The hatchlings saw him and squealed, wings flaring. They tried to bare their tiny teeth and then crumpled back into themselves. Quivering, one, the smaller, blurted in broken galactic common like someone trying to sing a song they'd only heard once. "Please, don't hurt us, Mommy is dying." Mason's throat closed. The rifle strap bit his shoulder and he let it go. It thudded on the floor, a clumsy, stupid human thing. He stepped closer, hands raised, palms open. The smell coming off the mother was scorched protein and something clean underneath, like rain on iron. He knelt. The hatchlings pressed against the mother's jaw and peered up at him. Their pupils were vertical slits and trembling. Their bodies kept giving away their fear with little full-body shivers. He could see where the mother's armor plates, once pearled gold, had bubbled and split. Plasma burns, shrapnel. The kind of ruin no field kit could make right, not for long. He opened his med case anyway. His hands shook as he cracked the nano-gel ampule white vapor curling into the room's warmth. He spoke without thinking because silence would have swallowed all of them. "Easy, I won't hurt you." The gel hissed as he pressed it into the splits and scorches of the mother's chest plate. It stitched a little life to a few edges, stopped a few leaks. The little ones watched every movement with tears bright in their eyes like wet mercury. The mother's single open eye found him, focused. She made a sound that was not a growl and not a sigh, but something old and tired. Her mouth moved and a voice came out like boulders grinding in a river. "Human," she said. The word had weight. "Why?" He swallowed and shrugged. The gesture felt absurd, because no one should die alone. The big eye blinked. The long throat tried to lift and failed. Children, she said, and her gaze slid to them like it weighed a mountain. Embrace, Solith, listen. Mommy, whispered the bolder one, voice breaking. Listen, she said, and there was a note there that even human ears knew meant obey. This one is not like the others. Mason felt it like a stone thrown into water, outward rings of meaning. The others, the human others, the soldiers who had burned nests and called it a strategic asset denied. The pilots who had flown in tight to feel the air rip and then reported the city pacified. The mother's chest rose, shuddered, stilled for too long, rose again a little. Her eye dimmed and brightened like a light failing. Protect them, she said to Mason. Promise, human, speak so the sky hears. I promise, he said, and it came out fierce, startling him. I swear it. Her gaze eased. The great head sagged a fraction. The sound of her breath left and did not return. The little ones pushed at her jaw and keened a sound that didn't belong in the throat of any predator. Grief had the same grammar everywhere. Mason closed his eyes and sat with them, hand on warm, tiny shoulders, until the sound wore itself down to whimpers and silence. He might have sat there forever if the world hadn't decided it wanted the last word. The ceiling trembled like a drum struck in a neighboring room. The dust jumped in a circle around his boot. Through cracks in the wall, light went white and then blue. He knew that light. He'd watched it from the underside of gunships and from the edge of trenches. Orbital sterilization. The fleet had come back to finish what it started. Up, he said, standing too fast, head spinning. We're leaving. The hatchlings clung to the air with their claws. We can't, whispered the small one. She flies with us, Mason said, and then heard his own lie and gentled it. She's in you, we have to live or the promise dies. He led them through the failing corridors, out into the world where the sky was a silver furnace. He saw the rain of light sweep the horizon flat and felt it roll like a pressure change through his chest. His suit shouted warnings at him until he shut the warnings off. They sprinted, or two ran and one limped, as the glass plane softened to a mirror under the rain of fire. A maintenance hatch yawned black in a field of scorched pylons. He pried it open with a piece of rebar and shoved the hatchlings through, then dropped after them, sealing the hatch above just as a light fell where he had been standing. The air shook. Heat bloomed and clutched at the hatch edges, furious to get in. Mason and two baby dragons crouched in the old bones of a forgotten service tunnel and listened to the planet scream. In the long night that followed, Mason learned their names properly. Ember for the bolder one, Solis for the smaller, though he learned quickly that their language turned names into half-sung, half-breathed syllables meant to slide around teeth and smoke. He told them his name, Mason, as their tongues could say it. He told them there had been an echo team and that he had once been one of many instead of a single leftover thing. He broke ration bars into pieces. They sniffed them, made faces at the smell, and ate anyway, and then brought him a relic they found in the dark. A canister of sweet mineral paste designed for diggers, which he ate and made a face at, and they laughed. The laughter was strange, like a chirp turned liquid. It chased the heat's shadow back a little. When the surface cooled enough to touch, he opened the hatch to a world that had changed its mind. Where a city had stood was a pavement of fused glass cut by the black bones of towers. A river had boiled away to a trench that smoked. The sky above was an exhausted bruise shot with morning light. No ships, no signals, just them. For 3 days he listened for comms and heard only the whispers you hear in your own blood when you're too still. On the 4th, he turned the receiver off. Then the living began. He salvaged what he could from the dead. A collapsed drone cradle yielded a Merlin tool that could cut, weld, and heat a space with a whisper. A pantry under the spire held grain bricks that the hatchlings would eat if he softened them in river water. An emergency shelter module from a crashed scout pod inflated into a skin of warmth and space. And the first night they slept under a roof, Ember poked the wall with her nose and declared it smelled like ship belly and then curled around his calves. and slept with a little trilling hum that did not belong in any human lullaby. They learned each other's shapes and edges. Mason learned that fear jerked a hatchling's tail flat against the floor, that pleasure made little lightning flexes down their wings, that shame saw their heads tuck and their scales darken. He learned they watched his face for cues, as human children do, and that they could smell lies like smoke. He learned to cook river fish until the oils turned sweet and cracked, to carve hooks from salvage, to set trip lines that glittered in his periphery but were invisible to predators. He learned the planet's new weather and the sound the wind made when it got lost on the new glass. He learned a lullaby, hummed under his breath and never pulled from memory on Titan Station, a thread of sound he wove from silence until their breathing slipped into sleep. Ember learned to climb. She found the light in the Merlin tool and chased it like a moth, pouncing, triumphant. Solis learned to read his hand signs. He showed them letters on his cracked slate and wrote their names 100 times. They traced the strokes with careful claws and then wrote them back to him in their arcs and slashes of calligraphy that belonged on a cliff more than a screen. They buried the mother when the ground thawed enough to dig. The trench where the river had been accepted her. Ember brought a mirror scale she'd shed and put it with the hard, strange tenderness of children trying to make a ritual with their bare hands. Solis placed a coil of copper wire he'd found in the ruins, a bright circle like a sun segment. Mason placed a dog tag he had kept from a time before. The wind carried their voices away like confetti. Months made themselves into a year. Mason's beard grew in crooked. The hatchling stretched, and then, over a handful of days like a lightning storm, they didn't look like babies anymore. They were longer, heavier. Their wings stopped being ornaments and started being tools. When they flapped them, the dust turned into circles around their claws. Ember was the first to catch air. It was an accident. She leaped a fissure and forgot to come down. She hovered for a heartbeat, eyes wide with terror, then came down on the other side and screamed laughter until Solis tried, failed, tried again, and then found the updraft like a ribbon. The first time they made a real glide, all the way from the broken spire's base to the wind-carved humps of the Black Hills, Mason felt something tear in his chest and reknit with light. He taught them what he could of humans that would not hurt to carry. He told them about ocean cities that floated under glossy storms, about streets under glass domes, where children ran to school in socks to slide farther. He told them about the first time he had stepped outside into Titan Station's low gravity, and realized the universe had made room for him in more than one direction, and how a person can be afraid and brave inside the same heartbeat and it still counts. They told him about heat sleep and bone memory, about how Threxian mothers sang history inside their eggs so their children were born half full of old songs. They told him the way colors smelled when you ran your tongue along the lip of a storm cloud. They told him that stone remembers footsteps if you walk the same path enough times, and that their kind had walked these cities long before the copper bells. They told him that a mother was everything at first: sky, fire, food, law, love. When Solis said the last word, his voice broke and Ember stared at the distance until the distance looked back and then stopped. When trouble came, it came quiet first. A black pollen settled on the glass plane. It looked harmless. When the wind drove it into drifts, it turned the edges of his shelter gold and the leaves of the new plants a little too shiny. Then the coughing started, Mason first, then Ember, then Solis. Not a human cough or a dragon cough, but something that made heat in the joints and slowed breath. Mason wore a filter and laced the shelter's seams. He burned the drifts where they collected and the smoke smelled sweet and wrong. He boiled water until it wept clarity. He spoke calm even when his hands shook because calm was a blanket he could tuck around them. The fever hit Solis hardest. He lay curled with his head under his wing and refused all water until Ember put her nose to his and said, voice like broken glass, "Drink because I say so." And he obeyed and lived. When the wind turned and carried the pollen out to the Black Hills and then away, they crawled out into a world that knew them a little too well now. You can love a place and fear it, and the love can be bigger. They stayed. They would have stayed forever if the stars had been kind. Stars in war are not. The day the human ship returned, it was all shine and straight lines. A mine layer escort with a belly full of small teeth and a bridge that would have made Titan Station kids put their hands to glass. It hung above the horizon and turned the light strange. Then it spat dropships and they came down on tails of flame and put their shadows into the old streets like a different sort of tree. Mason knew at a glance that it wasn't rescue. The ship held its nose like it smelled profit. He raised his hands and walked into the open anyway, because sometimes you have to be seen, or you will be mistaken for something else. The first squad's commander was a woman with a neat scar that ran from ear to jaw like a measuring line. Her stance told him she thought the planet belonged to her because someone had put a stamp in a book. She didn't ask him his name. She said, "Identify." "Corporal Mason Real Echo Team," he said. His voice made the squad shift their grips. He had been gone too long to sound like anyone's here and now. "This world is not empty." She laughed, a short, bright sound. "It's a burnt ball we're here to harvest." "Harvest what's left of the city," one of the soldiers said too loud. "The spire cores, the lives," Mason said, and the word sounded old enough to make a few heads turn. "There are lives here. Threxians," the commander said, and the way she spat the X turned it into a cut. "Children," Mason said, and in that moment Ember and Solis made the sort of choice that children make when they have loved you longer than fear has. They came out of hiding. Their scales had darkened from years of sun. Their wings were long, their eyes bright. They stood behind Mason and did not try to look bigger than they were. For a breath, surprise held the humans gentle. Then training clawed Surprise's eyes out. "By the core," someone said, and rifles came up and the commander's scar went white. "Hostiles, drop them." Ember flinched, Solis shrank. Mason stepped left until the rifles looked straight at him. "No," he said. "Stand down, Corporal," the commander said, and the part of his brain that had loved the roll call. The shine of the flag, the weight of duty answered her tone and almost moved his feet. He locked his knees. "They're not monsters," he said. There, one young soldier on the left had hands too eager for a trigger. Mason saw the micro-witch and did not think. He shouldered into him, knocked the muzzle up. The plasma bolt grazed Mason's shoulder with a bite of lightning and set a slab behind him smoking. The air went white. Ember screamed, a narrow sound that made instruments on the dropship spike. Solis opened his mouth and heat poured out. It wasn't a weapon so much as a cry with temperature. It struck a drone boom, melted it, and the drone shrieked and died. Everything ruptured. Mason moved because you move or you fold. He didn't shoot to kill. He shot to sting and blind and slam people off their feet. He broke sight lines and spoke their names. Taran, Duck, Jules. Don't, because that's what a corporal does when he wants to save lives while the saving looks like loss. Ember vaulted and put her body between a rifle and Solis and took a bolt across the shoulder, and screamed and bit the air and snapped the barrel and threw it away. The commander's voice raked the air into orders, and the orders did not fit the moment, and so they shattered on contact with the mess of it. It ended because too much heat had burned off, too much adrenaline had turned to salt on tongues. A silence fell that felt like the before sound of a bell. Mason was on one knee, panting. The commander was up against a chunk of wall, chest heaving, eyes fixed on him with a look he had seen on new pilots who'd glanced too close to a star. Fear, anger, shame at the fear, hunger to hide the shame in orders. Blood ran down someone's leg. A drone's core clicked as it cooled. Mason stood. His shoulder was hot and his vision had a shadow on the left that meant a blood vessel had popped something in his eye. He stood anyway. "Don't," he said, "quiet the way a storm goes quiet before it really starts. Listen, we don't have to end the species here in a street you can't even remember the name of. Do not, the commander said, like she was the one holding herself back, and then her voice cracked and she dropped the pitch. They killed our colonies. They killed our people. A soldier spat. The words tasted like Titan Station's metal wall. Mason forced himself to stand inside the whole picture, and not just the corner that painted him a hero or a traitor. We killed theirs. We bombed nests and wrote reports that called the little ones whelps like the word made it easier to step over them. Maybe they burned our worlds because we built on their mother's bones. Maybe they did it because fear is a coward that wears a lot of uniforms. You're out of line, the commander said. Maybe, Mason said, and found a smile at the edge of himself, but I'm not out of heart. Then he did the thing that put his promise into muscle and blood. He turned his back to the humans and faced the dragons. Ember, Solis, fly. They stared. Not without you, Solis whispered. Promise travels on breath, Mason said. Breathe. Go. Ember stared a heartbeat more, and then something in her made a choice. She crouched, sprang, and the air took her. Solis followed, ragged and brilliant. Their wing beats thundered like two old flags coming down. The commander saw the opening to solve her problem with clean lines. Drop them, she said, and the rifles rose. Mason stepped into those clean lines and made them dirty with his body. The first bolts tore through his armor and the world narrowed to a bright thread. He fired not to kill, to knock the shots wild. He moved with a memory his body didn't know it still carried, the one where he took the fall because he was the one wearing stripes. He fell backward into black. He woke to a ceiling painted in a smear of dawn. He was in the shelter. Someone had dragged him there. His shoulder was banded in cloth that smelled like dragon and river. His ribs had a pressure that belonged to a long wing folded gently over him. Ember was watching him with the focus you use to sew a wound. Solis sat in the doorway and looked at the in-between world with an expression that had broken and rebuilt something. They had not flown far. They had flown just far enough to turn around. I told you to go, Mason croaked. We did, Ember said, voice a growl and a song. We went to get you. He tried to get up and the world argued. The world won. He lay back and stared at the roof and laughed once because it didn't know what else to do. Then he cried because his body had built tears to do this job and it would not be stopped. Ember put her head against his ribs and let his tears soak scales. The second wave came with bigger shadows, tanks that walked on legs like quiet nightmares, mechs whose heads were nothing but weapon. Dropships that did not bother with the pretense of flags. The commander might have argued for time to speak, the ship above like schedules. Mason stood anyway. He wrapped his shoulder in a sling made from a piece of parachute silk. He kissed Solis on the nose because there is something in every language that recognizes that gesture. He walked into the open one more time. Why do you keep doing that? Solis whispered. Because sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing that sees you, Mason said. And sometimes the thing that sees you needs help seeing. He got as far as the old square before the mechs found him and put a red dot on his chest. He thought of Titan Station, of lunch lines and jokes about coffee, of a child running slide foot across a corridor. He thought of a promise to a mother who had asked him to speak so the sky would hear. He thought wildly of copper bells. He did not have one, he had a voice. Stop, he said, and he did not shout because shouting wastes sound. This place is a sanctuary. Something moved behind the mechs. Not human, not quite the ghost of a thought Ember had carried in her bones since Egg's song. Dragons came out of the hills like the hills had grown teeth. Not two, a dozen, then more behind them. Their scales held mirrors. Their eyes held memory. They were not the ones who had died in the city. These were wild cousins, mountain kin, sleepers who had woken to the smell of grief and the echo of a song a mother had sung under the earth. Ember and Solis had found them after the first fight, pleaded, sang. Memory had recognized memory and pulled them up by the heart. They didn't attack. They landed. They stood behind Mason the way cliffs stand behind shore. Their chests rose and fell like the lungs of a long animal. They looked at the mechs without flinch. When they spoke, the air moved in ways that remembered cave and thunder. "We are not a harvest," said the largest. Her scales were the color of old brass, and her voice was the inside of a bell that had rung once a century and chosen this hour for its second note. "We are memory and fire and children. Your metal will not make bones for your grandchildren if you stack it on graves." The ship sent its voice down in a tight-beamed command. The commander listened and looked at Mason and looked at the dragons and looked at her own people and recognized, belatedly, that history had walked her into the square and expected her to put banality inside it. She was not built for banality. She lifted her hand. "Hold," she said. The mechs shivered like leashed hounds. The ship did not like it. Orders came down with a note very close to anger. She did not look up. She looked at Mason. "What do you want?" she asked. Mason could have asked for a crate of med foam, for transport to an outer world with trees that grow like thousand-armed saints, for a full pardon for the corporal who had stood between rifles and a promise. He asked for something stupid and simple and as large as a sky. Time. For what? The commander said, already hearing the ship screaming in her ear. "For a new story," Mason said. "For one where we don't clean the streets with what's left of another mother's children." He didn't know if it was the exact words or the way Ember's body leaned toward him like a living answer. He didn't know if it was the way the other soldiers had started to look older around the eyes, or the way the mountain dragons had lifted their heads all at once like a field turning to sun. He didn't know if the commander had a niece on a station somewhere. He only knew that she looked at the mechs, then at the dropships, then at the heavens, and then she did not give the order she had been sent to give. She said, "We're pulling back." History enjoys a hinge. This was one. The ship above did not adjudicate well. It sent down a strike as punishment and a warning. The bolt came like a train of white glass. It would have turned the square into an idea and Mason into a smear of old light. Ember moved. She did not think or plan. She leaped and spread everything she had learned about sky over the man who had taught her to be something besides a weapon. The bolt found her back. It hit where the old wound still carried a ghost. She screamed a sound that would have made copper bells melt, and then she held, and the energy broke around her like lightning frightened of a tree. Solis launched and found the world a tunnel shaped like the ship. His heat was not a spear but a bloom. He poured it into the bolt's dying afterimage and turned its edges. The strike whined away into a lake beyond the city and turned it into steam and fish bones. The ship above shifted from anger to calculation, which is always a victory if you are small. Then everything happened because everything had to. The mountain dragons lifted together and rose like a cliff, refusing obedience to erosion. They did not fall on the mechs. They laid down a wall of heat between the humans and the square that shimmered like a mirage. They sang through the heat old songs that had opened eggs and cracked stone. The mech stepped forward, tasted the song, and stopped. Somewhere, a soldier with shaky hands lowered his rifle, and then a second did, and then a third. The commander stared up at the ship and said one syllable in a tone you reserve for the time you tell your parent you will not be who they want. "No." She turned to Mason and spoke quietly as if privacy could be built in air. "I can lose a command," she said. "I won't lose my soul." He nodded. Blood ran down his side. Ember's back smoked. Solis shook and pretended he did not. Mason looked at the square, at the edges of the old city, at the bones of the spire, at the shaft of light that had slid between two broken beams and struck the dust into diamonds. He felt time reach for his hand like a child who wanted to cross a street. "Then help me build," he said. "Help us make a place where we can be strange together without dying for the wrong syllables." The commander laughed once rough, shook her head, did not stop smiling. "We're soldiers. Soldiers can build," he said. "We remember how to stack sandbags when the river rises." They built. It was slow at first, awkward as a handshake that doesn't know where to put the thumbs. The ship above left and took its threat with it, and also its easy supplies. The commander used words like requisition and salvage, and Mason heard pleas in the spaces between. The soldiers who had lifted rifles carried water and learned the heat of it, and the weight of it as it sat inside old pipes. The mountain dragons brought stone that had been under pressure long enough to teach you things about patience. Ember and Solis hunted and brought meat, and then learned to share it without turning it into dominance. There were fights. There were mistakes that looked bigger than they were, and small mercies that repaired big tears. There were nights when wind got mean again, and everyone slept in one big room because heat is easier to hold when you make yourself into a single creature. They called the place that grew in the cities ribs a sanctuary, because the word tasted right in both throats. It was a tangle of scaffolds and stairs through broken towers, lights made from captured drones, gardens in old fountain bowls. There were rules and they were simple. No killing here, not even in big words. No stealing because want is honest if you ask. No lying because lies rot food and courage both. There were other rules, but those three did the heavy lifting. Refugees came, first a caravan of miners from the far hills with dust in their hair and planet-bound hope in their pockets. Their leader put his hat in his hands and looked at Ember like she was a storm he had regretted and said, "We heard there was a place." Then a handful of Threxian young, wild cousins like the mountain clan, unsure how to make themselves small enough to share space with humans, awkwardly holding out gifts of quartz and bone. Then a ship from a human outpost with engines held together by gratitude and chewing gum. Its captain had eyes that had done the math and wanted a different result. They came because the galaxy, even when quiet, is never kind. They came because rumors had rolled along trade routes and emergency broadcasts, dragons that didn't kill evac ships, soldiers who set down rifles without being told, a man who had put himself between a promise and a simple order and had made that line hold. The sanctuary learned how to feed mouths in multiple sizes. It learned which jokes worked across languages and which ones required a drawing. It learned that Threxian children liked the feel of water on their wing membranes so much they would pretend to be dirty just to be washed again, and that human children liked the feel of scales so much they would invent chores that involved touching them. It learned that during storms, it was easier to stand if the dragons lay in a ring around the buildings and let the wind hit their backs first. Mason became the thing he had never trained for, a center. He tried not to be. He flinched when people looked at him like a flag and pointed them toward the commander or Ember or Solis or the cook who had worked out how to make spice carry over both sets of taste buds. But centers are not chosen. They are grown by gravity. He walked the scaffolds at night, checked the solar arrays, tested ropes, laid his palm on warm scales here and cool metal there, listened to the deep and shallow breaths of a place learning to be alive. He didn't realize he'd become a legend until a kid from the outpost ship ran up, hair in his eyes, and scuffed to a panting stop. "Mr. Real," the boy said, too formal for his own mouth. "They're saying you shook the galaxy." Mason laughed. "I shook my knees. The galaxy did what it wanted. But legends do a thing that reality sometimes forgets to. They move faster than ships. The first time a human fleet came not to burn but to ask. The admiral wore a uniform like a question mark. She stood on the square where copper bells had once hung and looked up at dragons perched on broken arches like gargoyles with breath. She looked at the ring of tents made from parachute silk and the hydroponic racks humming like bees in the mountain dragon's hall, half cave, half cathedral, where children of two kinds made a noise that meant alive. She looked at Mason. "Word is," she said dryly, "you're both a problem and a solution. Probably half of each depends on the day, Mason said. She didn't smile exactly, but her mouth learned a new shape. We have worlds dying at the edges, she said. We need a ceasefire that isn't a pause between bomb runs. The Threxian elders won't answer our envoys. They don't like your messenger's breath, Ember said from behind Mason, and the Admiral started and then disguised the start with a nod. Ember stepped forward. Fire scar faded to a pearl-colored arc over her back. They will answer us, she said, if you don't bring those words that make our ears bleed. Legalese, Mason translated, and Ember made a face the Admiral recognized from 1,000 rooms with tables in them. They want songs, Ember said, softer, or something that holds like a song. They want a story that does not require teeth to end. The Admiral's eyes met Mason's over the edge of a mind changing itself. Can you? We can try, Mason said, because that's what humans do for the things too big to promise. They tried. The elders came to the sanctuary not on a day with banners, but on a day that smelled like rain. They wore dust and old light. Their horns had been broken in places and regrown. Their eyes had that Farsi look, the one that you could drown in if you weren't careful. They walked into the square, put their heads together over the center, and breathed out. The breath was smoky and sweet and sad. Speak, they said, and the word hung in the air like a bell you could see. Mason spoke. He did not speak as a soldier or a man who had bled on orders. He spoke as someone who had washed pollen off scales and boiled fish and held his breath while a child learned the shape of sky. He spoke the first promise, protect them, and added a second, protect the ones who come with open hands, and then a third, protect against the parts of ourselves that like the sound of fire too much. Ember spoke. She sang egg words and city words and grief words, and then those thin sweet notes that hatchlings used to call their mother's heart back into its old shape if it has wandered. The elder's scales shivered. The Admiral put her words on the table like bread. She did not say corridor of neutral space and mutually assured nothing. She said place to breathe and a time of quiet long enough to bear fruit. She said if the winds change we will not call them betrayal if we have taught the winds to be gentle first. The elders consented not with signatures but with a pulse of heat. It lifted the hair on everybody's arms and crests. It was old. It was enough. The first ceasefire held. The second, negotiated with more laughter, held longer. The third had a word in it that shared itself across languages like a secret told children first. Sanctuary. Then the colony ships that lived in the worst parts of the map turned slightly toward better. Then somebody on a rich world stopped wearing a shirt made from the mining of a poor one long enough to ask why. Then a war correspondent wrote the sentence that would be on school walls for a generation. A soldier stepped between fear and the easiest story, and a planet remembered how to listen. The galaxy shifted like a spine cracking after a long crouch. There were those who hated it. There were generals who had polished their souls into mirrors and did not like fingerprints. There were dragons who thought mercy was a word humans used to hide knives in. There were raiders and profiteers and the sort of people who sell maps to safe places and then burn the map huts after. There were battles on the edges, always on the edges, where people who would never meet Mason or Ember died for the idea that safety belongs to anybody who can pay for it. There were nights when the sanctuary's lights guttered and everyone waited in a hush for the generator to catch again. They caught. The lights came up. Some nights slower than others, but they came up. Mason aged. He did not age into a statue. He aged into a man who could lift a coil of wire as if it were an infant and lay it into a tray of tools like a poem. He forgot his soldier's haircut and let his hair learn what wind meant. He argued with Ember once for an entire afternoon about whether the new refugees' children should be allowed to climb the old bell tower without ropes. He conceded when a middle-sized dragon demonstrated a rope harness that looked like a boat and would hold 10 human kids, 4 Threxian, and a sack of apples without complaint. He learned to sit on a parapet at dawn with soulies and drink something hot, while the sound of scales warming in sun made its own music. One winter the pollen came again, thicker and meaner. Soulies went down and stayed down. Ember stayed awake for 3 days and kept her brother's breath moving by humming into his mouth, and the sound made the shelter walls remember caves, and the caves remembered their own breath and gave it back. Mason sat outside because he had learned that sometimes you cannot go into a room without making it worse, and he sanded a piece of glass for 8 hours until it took on the shape of a lens. When he held it up, the light split and painted his hands, and he went inside with a new pocket of hope and cut the pollen masks to fit better under dragon jaw lines. Soulies lived. Human and dragon kids painted a word on the side of the shelter afterward in both scripts. Remembered. The commander, the first one, the one who had said no to the ship, came back from a tribunal with her rank in question and left with a new one nobody had invented yet, Keeper of Edges. She liked it. She liked how it said her work out loud without making it sound like a fence. She married an engineer who had a laugh that sounded like bolts clicking home and a way of seeing what metal wanted. They built a walkway together that cut through the worst winds like a hymn. There were memorials. You cannot build a place for peace without building places for grief. The first was not for humans or dragons, but for the city itself. A circle of copper bells recovered from the ruins, hung from ribs of the spire. Nobody rang them for a long time. Then on a day that smelled like lemon and oil, a dragon child reached up barely and tapped one with a claw. It made a note like a fish turned to air. The child laughed and tapped again. The sound became the sanctuary's heartbeat. When Mason finally climbed to the top of the bell rib and looked out, he could see the lines where the war had written itself and where the new story had written over it. The glass plains still caught light like 1,000 flat seas. The black hills still shouldered the wind. The ruins wore gardens like scarves, careless and good. Down near the old river trench, a new river was finding itself. It made a sound like breath. "What are you thinking?" Ember asked behind him, her head rising to his shoulder, her eye level with his hands. "That I've built exactly one good thing," Mason said. She snorted. "You built a promise. Promises breed." He smiled and leaned his head against her cheek because people who live together long enough learn the exact weight of that move. "Will you make sure this thing outlives me?" he asked. She spluttered fire smoke in a scandalized laugh. "As if I would let you build a story I have to finish alone." He nodded. It was the wrong joke in the right moment or the right joke in the wrong one. Either way, it put heat in the air. The end came for Mason not with a battle but with a walk. He took the long path along the rebuilt river, past the garden where human children were inventing a game that required 7 rules and 3 referees, past the hall where the mountain dragons kept fossils and stories, past the wall where a kid had painted a mural of a man with his hand on a dragon's neck, and had gotten the hand wrong and had laughed, and painted 2 more, until the hand looked like responsibility instead of ownership. He walked up the slope where the wind found its first anger and greeted it as an old companion with a new temper. He reached the little terrace someone had carved for him without telling him, 2 benches and a view that would have made a poet give up and go into farming because no words would do, and he sat down. The sunlight had an old coin warmth. His shoulder ached like an old friend who makes you aware of weather. He closed his eyes. He dreamed of Titan Station and the smell of metal and a girl running slide foot under white lights. He dreamed of copper bells to call a city home. He dreamed of a mother asking him to speak to the sky and the sky clearing its throat to listen. He dreamed of learning to cook for children who did not have hands for forks. He dreamed of a bolt of white glass and of a body, wing and fire and love, stepping between him and the easiest story. He dreamed of the word time and took a little more. When Ember found him, he looked like a man who had finally learned what sleep was for. She sat and pressed her head to his shoulder. Solis landed behind them and stopped when he felt the shape of the air. They did not move him. They did not cry the way babies do. They made a sound like winter sun. They breathed with him once, twice, and then they breathed for themselves and for him forever. The memorial they built for him was not a statue, and it was not a stone. It was a path. It began at the square and wound up through the gardens and past the bell rib and along the river and up to the terrace. Anyone could walk it. The planks of it had stories carved into them by hands of all sizes, in 2 languages and some other quiet ones. He taught me to boil water. He taught me to sand glass until it saw better. He taught me that promises are bones you hang muscle on. He taught me to fly, but only after I learned to land. Embers of him are everywhere. He is in the shape of this place. On the day they finished the path, human ships and Threxian flyers came and hovered over the square at the same height, as if agreeing unconsciously not to cast shadows on each other. The admiral who had learned to taste the word sanctuary said into a mic, voice shaking and unashamed, "We come to dedicate what is already ours." The elders breathed. The mountain dragons lifted their heads as if a hand had stroked their spines. The bells learned a new chord. Ember and Solis stood at the top of the path, side by side. They had grown precisely into the space the world had given them. If you looked with eyes trained only for war, you saw weapons. If you looked with eyes that had lived here, you saw guardianship and a particular tender stubbornness. Ember spoke first, not to the crowd because she disliked crowds, but to the air. "He kept a promise," she said. "We keep the place where promises are kept." Solis added, soft and fierce, "He made us a way to be dragons without always being fire." Later, much later, when the sanctuary's children, any species, asked where the world had changed, the old ones pointed at the square. They said, "A man put his body in the way and then did not move. A dragon did the same and learned it was the same move." They said, "The galaxy did not shake all at once. It learned to stare at itself in a mirror and not look away. It learned to see that endurance is not just a wall you lean against while you wait for something to stop hitting you. It is a road you build with your hands out of scraps and mercy." When travelers came to Threxis Roman IV, the sanctuary welcomed them if they came with open hands. The towers grew gardens the way hair grows out of good health. The copper bells became a clock. Sometimes they rang for weddings, sometimes for grief, sometimes to remind everyone to come to dinner. The mountain dragons told stories standing very still, the way their kind does when they want the listeners to walk inside the tale. Humans told stories walking in circles with their hands. Children learned to translate both kinds of telling without thinking about it. They could not keep the whole galaxy from breaking itself, but they taught pieces of it to mend. They taught edges to soften. They taught ambassadors to bring baskets of food instead of folders. They taught soldiers that laying down a rifle can be a bigger act than learning to fire it. They taught dragons that heat belongs in more places than vengeance. On a summer day 12 years after the first promise, a raider band tried to use the sanctuary as a corridor. They came in black ships with painted faces and a hunger that looked like pride. They found the bells ringing, not an alarm, a greeting. They found a line of humans standing with their hands open and dragons behind them with their wings closed. They found a road that had written on it in 2 scripts, "Not here." The raiders could have laughed. They did not. They turned around because something old had put its hand on their necks and pulled gently backward. Later, their leader wrote in her log that she had felt a city watching her the way a parent watches a child who has just learned to reach for hot pans. When Ember slept, she dreamed sometimes of the mother under the earth and woke with heat in her chest and peace over it like a blanket. When Solis slept, he dreamed sometimes of sky, and when he woke, he taught hatchlings to trust their wings and not to despise the ground. They raised 3 clutches between them, not of their bodies because the sanctuary made new kinds of family, but of whoever needed raising at the time. Some were human, some were dragon, some were neither. Love did not require categories to be useful. At the very edge of the sanctuary, Where the river had bitten the glass plane down to stone and found its old bed again, someone put up a simple sign. It had no insignia. It had no law written on it. It had a sentence that could be spoken by a throat with fangs or a throat with teeth, or one with neither and still taste true. We are building a story where nobody has to be the monster to make the hero shine. Pilgrims traced the letters with their fingers and then walked the path. Some cried at the bench. Some laughed at their own old ideas and left them on the grass to be rained on. Some went home and changed their work, their treats for their children, the way they answered the door. Little things. Things that shift galaxies when they happen enough. After a while, the sanctuary stopped needing protection. That is the quiet end of a lot of wars. One day you realize the edges are being kept by grandmothers with baskets instead of soldiers with armor, and the baskets work better. When the first school off-world wrote a lesson plan about Threxus Roman 4, it asked a question at the top. What did the human do? Children offered answers with honey on their fingers and dirt under their nails. He rescued dragons. He said no. He built a place. He didn't shoot. He promised. The teacher let them speak and did not correct, because they were all right and none of them were enough. At the end she wrote one sentence on the board, in big letters, simple as a beam. He chose to endure. That's it. That's the trick no one tells you when you're young and full of thunder. You do not have to be the strongest hand or the brightest mind. You have to be the one who stays when staying is the hard thing, and keeps the promise made under a broken ceiling while the rain tries to find a way in. The sanctuary at Threxus Roman 4 did not end war. It did not perfect anyone. It did something harder. It gave the galaxy an example that would not die. Every time a ship's captain leaned over a map and hesitated, some apprentice would say quietly, "Remember Threxus." Every time a general's hand hovered over a screen that would racket the world into one more broken shape, someone in the room would clear their throat and say, "Sanctuary." Every time a dragon somewhere bared its teeth at a trespass and smelled grief under the stink of ignorance, some story in its bones would shift, and it would lower its head and say, "Speak." And when the copper bells rang on the anniversary of the first promise, because days matter when you carve them into your breathing, the sound went out on the wind and threaded itself through trade lanes, into kitchens, across bridges, through airlocks that sighed, and out into the deep where ships no larger than a stubborn hope went looking for something kinder than conquest. There are still histories written from blood, and there always will be. But on days when the sky is clear over Threxus Roman 4, you can climb the rib of the old spire and see where the new river braids light, and watch a human child hold up a hand to a dragon child and feel nothing but the knowledge that this, here, now, is the right story. If you listen, really listen, you will hear a promise spoken into a room where the wind was trying to be fire, and a mother under the earth sighing and allowing herself a little peace. If you listen harder, beyond the bells, beyond the games, beyond the lessons and the words, you will hear the oldest lesson the stars can teach. And that day the galaxy learned, humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.